Ymedia Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.
Ramona ji, welcome to Ymedia, Channel Y, Radio Y. Ji.
Hello, G. Great to be here with you today.
Thank you so much. Ramona ji, please let us know about the current situation regarding Iran. What is going on? The ceasefire will continue or no? There will be talks in Islamabad. It will go positive way. Yes, please.
Yes, absolutely. You know, we've been at the edge of our seat this past few days, first with the ceasefire that just happened, but then the first day after the ceasefire, we saw that the bombings continued on Lebanon by the Israeli forces, and we know that Iran had proposed that that would be also a ceasefire for Lebanon in their 10-point plan that President Trump said he is reviewing and he can negotiate on this upcoming negotiations tomorrow in Pakistan. And then we heard, news about whether the Strait of Hormuz is open or it's closed. Then Iran saying that, anyone who wants to go by has to take permission. So it was a lot of, different types of stories that were going around yesterday in terms of what it means. We know the bombardments increased in Lebanon, 100 strikes in 10 minutes, and the devastations continued. But today we have, big news with Israel saying they're going to have direct peace talks with Lebanon. So this is a major turn of events for what we've seen this war rage on for about 40 days. And this is a big deal because the Israeli prime minister, he's essentially said that he will begin negotiations with Lebanon as soon as possible. And this is ahead of the meeting that is taking place tomorrow. You have the names there between the United States as well as Iran. You have J.D. Vance, who is the vice president, who's been traditionally against foreign wars. This is what he had campaigned on, as well as President Trump, and when they won their last election. And then you have Jared Kushner, who is the president's son-in-law, who was very active in the president's first administration, if you recall, and Steve Witkoff, who's going to be part of those meetings. So you have the two people there, Kushner and Witkoff, and the new individual who's going to be there at the talks is going to be Vice President J.D. Vance, which is very good news because hopefully we're going to not see this go sideways like we did the last time, where there was information that, from Oman, that there was going to be an agreement reached. And then things really changed 2 days later when the strikes on Iran happened on February 28th, which led to this almost 40-day war. And then on the Iranian side, you have the parliament speaker, Ghalibaf, who's going to be there. And of course, the foreign minister, Ayakchi, who has been, really doing a lot of interviews in the past little while in mainstream media to really talk about what Iran's stance is. So this is, we're all waiting to see what's to come of it. But the good news here is the escalations in Israel and Lebanon. For them to have peace talks, it's a very big deal. And if Israel scales back on the attacks in southern Lebanon, then it could be a huge shift. Now, that's the upside in terms of the best case scenario. And then we could look at, I don't want to say the worst case scenario of what this could all mean. Could it be that this is buying time to, position the U.S. military as well as Israel to continue what's been going on? Are we really going to have peace talks? And more specifically on these 10 issues, right? These are big asks from Iran. Iran asking, I just want to go over the 10 points, massive things such as, it is, they're asking for a permanent end to the war. But to get that permanent end to the war, they're saying, we want guarantees that we're not going to be striked again. And this is something that Israel's going to have to provide a guarantee on, as well as President Trump. We've seen in this war from last year, the 12-day one, as well as this one that's gone on for 40 days, we've seen sometimes Israel does what it wants to do, which sometimes contradicts what President Trump is saying. So it's about getting them in line, which we saw the first day after the ceasefires, right? President Trump said they're going to accept the 10 points to negotiate on, and Israel said, no, no way, Lebanon's not part of it. Then the White House said, yes, Lebanon's not part of it. And so the good news today. So the 10 points are, full sanctions removal. If there are full sanctions removal, well, that is going to mean a big difference in terms of this Iranian regime that would become a lot stronger in the region, to be able to trade openly and having the embargoes lifted. That's been there for, half a century for many reasons. And then there's compensation on damages. Will the United States agree to, we're talking about trillions in reparations for infrastructure costs and all the damage that was done to Iran? And what does that mean in terms of Iran also perhaps providing compensation on what it has done in the GCC countries where the US military bases are? Is that going to be on the table? And if there's going to be no compensation for damages, does it mean that Iran, now that's asking to formalize its hold on the Strait of Hormuz with Oman, if they were to charge tolls and in that way, there are numbers floating around like $2 million for a ship to pass. We know that the countries that need that oil, $2 million is probably a bargain based on what they've gone through in the last 40 days. But what does that mean in the long-term aspect of things? Will things become more expensive, even though that was supposed to be a shipping route that's supposed to provide, cheaper and accessible energy, right? In terms of oil. So that's going to be something interesting to watch out for the talks tomorrow between the two nations, and Iran asking for influence over the regional conflict, right, which includes Lebanon. And that's the other thing. Like Iran is saying, hey, these are our proxies. It's Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas in Gaza, and that's why it's when we saw the strikes happen from Israel on to Lebanon, Iran was saying, well, we're not going to open up the Strait of Hormuz, or we're not going to agree to a ceasefire unless Lebanon's included, because of that proxy that they're responsible for. And Israel knows that, right? So that was another pull. And the bombardments that increased, perhaps that was the increase before saying, hey, we're going to talk directly with Lebanon. So very interesting movements on things. How could this go overall? I mean, is US really going to pull out of the region and allow Iran to have influence over that region? That is very unlikely. I'm going to go over the military bases that are throughout those GCC countries and what that means for the United States if it were to have less presence, which is what Iran is saying. In a way of saying, we want to ensure that we are not going to get any sort of retaliation or bombs in the future. It would also mean that those military bases should not be there. So that's, really what they're saying. And is that something that the United States would agree to? I highly think that would be unlikely because, we have the petrodollar, right? The United States, it's the US currency that trades on the oil, and for them not to have presence and for them not to have, that sort of influence that they do in the region, it's huge because of the military presence the United States has in the GCC countries. I mean, then they get those same countries that they buy oil from and allow for them to have their shipping routes, for them to invest heavily in the United States economy. And we've seen that happen from US treasuries to buying US debt to now massive AI centers that have gone up. And that's another thing, since this war has started, we have not talked about AI and superintelligence and what that's going to, what kind of impact it's going to have on how we live our lives. And of course, what we're hearing in terms of the employability of humans and how many job losses and how much lives could be greater because of it. So that's a whole nother thing that's, happening in the background of where our attention's going, which is this war. So it'll be interesting to see what will happen. Can they, can safer and calmer heads prevail in the meetings from both sides? Because there is definitely a trust deficit on both sides because of what we've seen in terms of ceasefire, but things still continuing. And we saw that last year as well. So that's really what's happening. But if we were to talk about, what it means about Iran having more influence in the region and US having less influence, well, let's look at that, right? The United States has a very strong military footprint in the Middle East, right? And they've done that because they've negotiated saying that we're going to keep you safe in case of any escalations with Iran. That did not happen in the last 40 days. So that's something else that I think a conversation that will happen between these GCC countries as well as the United States moving forward. But, in terms of strategic bases, the largest base, United States base, Army base, is in Qatar. And Navy assets are there, which are now, to have a presence in the Strait of Hormuz, to be able to frequently patrol the area. And then you have the buildups of what the U.S. military has done in terms of sending their F-35s and F-22 fighters in the area. So that's the other question, right? Those presence are still there while these negotiations happen. Iran is still allowing some ships in the Strait of Hormuz, but not without permission. So they're all, still holding their stance of saying, hey, if talks go sideways, we're all still positioned where we need to be, right? So those regional partners for the U.S. base are Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and we saw those bases getting attacked by Iran in these past 40 days. So that's where things stand right now. And if you want to look at what is happening in Iran, well, there's a little bit of a difference there, right? Even though the regime has said, okay, we're ready to have talks, there is a bit of a difference here when you look at the regional aspects of how Iran is set up. Okay, so you have 31 provinces in Iran, and the way the Iranian regime has set up their military, right? It's called the Mosaic Defense, and this is what it is a decentralized military strategy. And that was developed by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, in a way to withstand, superpowers, countries with nuclear capabilities like the United States and Israel in case of a war. Now, we've seen this war happen for 40 days. It started on February 28th with the assassination of Ayatollah Khamenei, as well as the high-ranking officials in the regime. So what that did was that immediately triggered this decentralization system of the military in Iran in all 31 provinces. So what that means is that no longer from a centralized position of where the war would continue, but because the Ayatollah was assassinated, then immediately those 31 provinces will have their own commanders, will have their own regional ways in terms of having their own military capabilities and to protect their base. So that's the other thing, right? So when you have 31 autonomous provincial commanders who are not communicating in a centralized fashion in Tehran, then you have what you're seeing in the reports that played out the day after, or even after the ceasefire was agreed on, right? The ceasefire was agreed on 90 minutes before President Trump's deadline. And then we were hearing there were still attacks from Iran to its neighboring countries. So could that be part of what, is part of this mosaic defense system that is decentralized and each province is defending themselves? So if that's, and that is the case, because essentially what is set up for is that in case there is no central system, the Ayatollah is assassinated, which he was assassinated, then these regions must fight to the end, right? To either win or lose. So that's another thing. Does that mean Tehran has now, because there's no centralized ability, has lost its communication with all these different provinces? How does it integrate back? There's many high officials that have been assassinated in this war that's taken place for 40 days. So that would be interesting to see if this deal is reached. What does it mean in terms of Iran getting hold of it? And we know that the new Ayatollah, no one has seen him. Yes, he did put out a press release early on when he was appointed to be the next Ayatollah. But we know that in the attacks, the previous Ayatollah was his father. He lost his father, his entire family, his wife, kids. he lost his entire family, and there's reports that he was also hurt in that bombing that happened on February 28th. So it'll be very interesting to know, where is he? Does he have a commanding role on Iran as well as the military? And in these 31 provinces, how do you do that? And so, a lot of things to really look into when it comes to these talks that are going to take place tomorrow. And of course, we're going to be watching. Of course, we're going to keep minute by minute update on how it progresses. And earlier today, President Trump had his meeting with the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, and what has come out of that meeting with President Trump is very frank in terms of really signaling a shift from NATO. As you recall, when the war was waged between the two countries, three countries, sorry, U.S., Israel, and Iran. Well, and Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. Well, if you recall, President Trump was asking its NATO allies to interfere, was saying, come help us open up the Strait of Hormuz. And the NATO countries said, no, this is not our war. Immediately after, the attacks on Iran that assassinated the Ayatollah and, high-ranking figures in the Iranian regime, you had Germany say they didn't know anything about it, they have nothing to do with it. You had Canada say they didn't know anything about it. Britain, the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, say, hey, we didn't know about this, we have nothing to do with it. So immediately they washed their hands, saying that this was not a joint effort. And weeks that continued, President Trump had asked for help and really didn't receive any. So, it was in a case where President Trump found himself with no allies, such as his NATO allies, and also no off-ramp until one was offered through this through Pakistan in terms of what they've been negotiating between all these different countries. Now, so now President Trump is not happy, right? And NATO saying essentially, this has nothing to do with NATO. We're supposed to be an offensive system, and this, in other words, they were saying, was an illegal war that started. There was no approval in the United States by its government by Congress to go into this war. It was a very immediate one that took everybody by surprise, and it seems like the only two nations that knew about it were Israel and the United States, who decided to launch the attacks. So, and also NATO saying, well, if you look at the geography, they're very close to Iran, right? And so if Iran is hitting Israel, then, what does that mean about Europe, which is right there? And of course, we know that there is proxies, such as those terrorist groups that are funded by Iran. What does that mean in a place like Britain, a place like Germany? Very, very significant things, which is why they spoke up very quickly. But today's meeting between President Trump and Secretary General Mark Rutte, went in a way where President Trump said, well, hey, we asked you for help, we didn't receive it, and now we're thinking about repositioning our personnel. So what does that mean? That could mean a huge shift in how NATO has positioned itself. And we know that NATO's there as, a defense mechanism against Russia, another real superpower and super threat to Europe. And that's why there's NATO. So currently there's about 3 million personnel across those member states. And Trump is saying, well, we don't necessarily want to share the burden. And also, if you recall, Trump saying, we don't need the oil that's coming out of the Strait of Hormuz. You guys need it, right? You guys need this energy, and you guys really should be defending what you need in terms of the region in the Middle East, and really trying to kind of push that responsibility back on NATO, and NATO did not bite. So now, President Trump saying that if he is to shift the troops from NATO, that would mean, a significant thing for what it means for NATO for Russia, but also saying that we might pull our personnel from Germany and Spain, Italy, and France, and and really reposition them in new locations such as Poland, Romania, Lithuania, Greece. And these could be the new potential locations, which could mean a significant shift. And we know that Poland is very close to the Russian border because you have Poland and then you have Ukraine, and then, you know, there's that whole conflict between Ukraine and Russia. So what does that mean in terms of reactions for Russia, and what does that mean for NATO in general? So a lot of moving parts that is really changing the way things are, the status quo of what we've seen take place, right? So so that's really the latest update from the region. And now, if you want to come back to, our local front in terms of Canada, well, Canada has made announcements. They did under Mark Carney, our Prime Minister. He was very happy that there was a ceasefire announced 2 days ago, but since the retaliations had continued in Lebanon, the strikes in Lebanon by Israeli forces, Prime Minister Mark Carney said that Lebanon should be part of the ceasefire. So, Canada has made a stance, and as well as some of its NATO allies have made a stance on that specific thing, which we saw today, a big shift in what Israel and Lebanon in terms of having their peace talks. But, we know that right now, today is day one of the Liberal Policy Convention taking place in Montreal. It's a 2-day thing, and this is on the heels of a big win for Prime Minister Mark Carney. Why is that? The fourth MP, Conservative MP, crossed the floor. This is huge. So far, since he became Prime Minister last year, he's been at the job for now a year. He's become a very popular figure in terms of what we're seeing on Capitol, on Parliament Hill. You have MPs crossing the floor, 5 so far, 1 NDP, 4 Conservatives. This is unheard of. This is unseen. This is historic in Canadian politics. And so what does it mean for the official opposition leader, Pierre Poilievre? What does it mean for Mark Carney that could be forming government as early as this Monday? And what to watch out for is, will there be other floor crossings before Monday? Because what we've heard is that the Conservative MPs that have crossed floor, they're being asked by their Conservative caucus members that they were part of the Conservative, their ex-Conservative caucus members, on how it's like being a Liberal MP. And this is huge. We've heard reports from mainstream media that there are at least 40 MPs that are worried in the Conservative Party about what it means for their seats if there were to be a re-election, because Mark Carney seems to be very popular. And why is he popular, right? I mean, he's been a year at the job. Prior to that, he wasn't a politician. He wasn't a mayor. He wasn't a councillor. He wasn't a premier. He wasn't an MPP. He wasn't an MP. He wasn't a senator. He was nothing in terms of what we could judge him on. When it comes to as a politician, what we knew of him was he's a banker. He was a central banker in Canada as well as in England. And so when the question came in terms of who do Canadians rely on to help us navigate in the economy, Mark Carney keeps getting 50% plus in terms of the votes in any polls done, and what we saw him in terms of forming a minority government. Which is a big deal, because if you recall, 6 months prior to that, there were massive amounts of Liberal MPs saying that they're not going to seek re-election. Well, that was because they believed that they could not win an election with Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party, 26 points ahead. Trudeau having the worst approval ratings at the time, and them saying, well, we're not going to seek, another election, because what's the point of losing? And then when Trudeau resigned, stepped down, it caused for a leadership election. Mark Carney came on. His numbers, the Liberal numbers and the Liberal fortunes completely changed. And I think that has a lot to do with President Trump, because President Trump was really, really, the way he spoke about Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, the way he spoke about Chrysler Freeland, and then it just escalated, right? The 51st state, calling Trudeau a governor, really, not a prime minister, not his counterpart. And then you saw that massive shift the first time Prime Minister Mark Carney showed up on at the White House. And, and in a way, the media realizing that, this is someone that at the time, today is a little bit different, but at the time, looking at President Trump having that level of respect for someone like Mark Carney in terms of his CV, he does have a very impressive CV of what he's accomplished in his lifetime. And then the rhetoric on the 51st state changed. And then, during the entire campaign time, a book, I guess, out of Doug Ford's playbook on elections, if you recall, when we had the provincial elections last year, Doug Ford, who is the chair of, the provinces, took a delegation to Washington, D.C. to try to fight against the tariffs and really saying, I'm focusing on tariffs. And that won him, another re-election. Mark Carney, well, it is a federal issue. When we saw him go over to Washington, D.C., or sending his ministers, his foreign affairs ministers, and all of that to trade ministers to D.C., we saw the poll numbers go up. So, it was just in the edge of, the average Canadian's mind that, hey, there's going to be tariffs. We're going to have job losses. Like when you look at what happened in Ontario with massive job losses in the auto sector, spinning us into what we saw affect the housing prices, purchases, and everything else as a domino effect. And then the tariffs that he said, 50%, and just throwing massive numbers out. Very scary for the Canadian economy, given that our biggest trading partner is the United States. It caught Canada in a way of, hey, wait a minute, our biggest trading partner that we've had, that we relied on, may not be so reliable. And if they pull back and they say America first and not this joint partnership, what does that mean? So we've seen Prime Minister Mark Carney really travel throughout the world trying to make trade agreements with the world's other biggest economies, with India, with China, going over to European Union, really making sure that the alliance is there for Canada and its Commonwealth countries, trying up to Australia. Massive, massive movements. Now, what does that mean for the average Canadian that's still seeking refuge when it comes to gas prices? Because we saw that go up in the last 40 days, right? When gas prices were at $1.30, we're looking at prices closer to $2 a liter, which is very massive. And of course, that affects everything else when it comes to this affordability. I mean, we've been talking about affordability in Canada for probably a decade now. And so is this the Prime Minister that's going to usher the way into affordability for Canadians? We know that this government alone has announced a lot of spending, right? Like when they announced their $122 million tariff aid, right? A lot of it, which, went to Quebec, because Quebec was also hit because of its trade partners with the United States. And, the Quebec government put out highlights of a $4.1 billion spending for a 5-year commitment. Talking specifically about, $400 million for businesses who are directly impacted by the U.S. tariffs, almost $200 million for companies that rely heavily on the U.S. markets and for them to diversify their export destinations. And, $900 million for regional economies, for forestry that was highly hit in Quebec, and tourism and biofood sectors. And we saw the same thing happen. Oh, and another thing that we saw Canada and Quebec offer, more specific in Quebec, is a deferral of GST, HST, and QST, which is the corporate income tax payments. And this waiver has, this waiver on certain installments and arrears will start from April 2nd, which is this month, to June 30th. We saw happen last year and continue for these sort of reliefs for businesses there. We saw the same thing, talks about the Ontario auto sector and what that means for Ontario jobs. And if you recall, do you recall our borders, which President Trump talked about, fentanyl crossing the border and us having to really, really increase the border service agency across the Ontario border. So these are some of the things that Ottawa has said, but has that been enough, right? We know that it also decided to invest about $4 million in wood manufacturing. And really, when it comes to the Alberta government having an initiative saying, hey, they're supporting the small to medium-sized businesses that are manufacturing when it comes to in Alberta. So, we know that the latest numbers in February was, it was like 84,000 jobs lost in Canada. So it's going to be very interesting to see what this prime minister is going to do in terms of being able to bring back jobs. We know that this prime minister has, met the NATO target of 2% of the GDP spending in the military. We know that the government of Canada pledged about $81.8 billion in their budget for defense spending. There was $6.6 billion in funding of Canadian defense strategy. They're saying that in the next decade or so, it's going to be highly funded with 600 defense firms, $9.6 billion in GDP of just creating 81,000 jobs in the Canadian economy. And some of that comes from, having jobs and positions in the Canadian defense sector and trying to create that as a powerful engine for the Canadian economy. We've seen this prime minister, really the spending has come from the government side to prop up the Canadian economy. But of course, we're interested in knowing what that means for the private sector. How can the private sector come back and thrive? We know the backbone of the Canadian economy is small businesses. And what are the challenges that small businesses are dealing with right now when it comes to trade and all of that? So aside from, the relief packages and the negotiations that are supposed to happen between the United States, Mexico, and Canada for our trade agreement, that's all supposed to be this year. So we'll see where things stand with these three nations, Mexico, United States, and Canada, and if they can come to a deal that really helps support the economies of these three countries. And that's where things are at. Now, the big news that, was just shocking through Parliament Hill about the floor crossings. Well, you had, Marilyn Gladu, which nobody expected, that has a seat in Southern Ontario, cross the floor. She is the fourth Conservative MP on a total of 5. So what does that mean for Prime Minister Mark Carney? We know that the new redistribution of the ridings that were created in the last election that took place last year, we know that the total seat count is 343. So for a party to have majority and to become the ruling party and to form government needs 172 seats. Now, these 5 floor crossings for Mark Carney to Mark Carney's Liberal Party has now brought the total to 171. So Mark Carney is just 1 seat shy away of a majority government. The Liberals, 171. The Conservatives are at 140. The NDP, 6 seats, right? We're talking about no party status. Like it's, and they already lost an NDP MP of Nunavut who crossed the floor just last month. The Bloc, 22 seats, the Green 1, and there's 3 vacant seats up for a by-election, which we're going to know the results of on Monday. Over the long weekend that just passed was the early voting, the advanced voting. On Monday, we'll know what happens in the 2 seats in Toronto that have been traditionally Liberal. One of them is Krista Freeland, who cleared up her seat, and the other one is in Montreal. And guess what? The policy convention of the Liberals today until tomorrow is in Montreal. So that should help shore up the votes in that sense. And so we're looking at what could be from this by-election a majority government for Mark Carney and then him pushing his agenda forward. If you recall, Trudeau was in a minority government. He really needed the NDP under Jagmeet Singh to prop up his government. And then they had the deal between the NDP and the Liberals to be able to push forward some of the NDP agenda, such as the universal dental care and some other initiatives that under Jagmeet Singh was pushed forward that the Liberals supported. And that was how that government was functioning. Fast forward to today, well, it looks like Mark Carney in just, matter of days, he's going to be forming a majority government. It would be quite a surprise if he doesn't, given that those 3 seats lean Liberal and his numbers are doing so favorably, which doesn't bode well for the Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre. Why is that? We know he just recently took a tour to the United States. He sat and did really popular podcast interviews with Joe Rogan, with the Diary of the CEO. Massive podcasts that have a lot of views. We know that the one on Joe Rogan has like millions of views. But is it too late? How many people in Canada watched it? Are Canadians, when they compare Pierre Poilievre against Mark Carney, how does that fare? We saw that really at the exit polls in last year's general election. Pierre Poilievre, when you compared him to somebody like Trudeau, who's been there for 10 years and dogged with scandals and unaffordability and everything else that has happened in Canada under Prime Minister Trudeau, the clear winner there was Pierre Poilievre. He was 26 points ahead. But now the question remains, going into an election, 26 points ahead, losing that election, losing your own seat. If you recall, Pierre Poilievre was an Ottawa area MP for 20 years. He lost that seat, which was supposed to be a Conservative seat, 20 years. He served it. He lost it to a Liberal. Then there was a by-election. He was able to get back into Parliament, having a re-election in Alberta, which is really Conservative heartland. But when you look at what his fortunes are, with now saying that there's tens, the number is 40 MPs really worrying about their seats in another general election under Pierre Poilievre, him losing 4 MPs, what does that mean in terms of how are you running your caucus? Why do your MPs feel like they need to cross the floor? So all of those questions are at play, which, he did survive the leadership review by the membership. The way the Conservative Party runs their membership reviews is if a Conservative leader loses an election, then the members get to have a leadership convention and they get to vote. Do we keep this leader or do we not? And usually that leader wants 80% and above to really have the confidence. It's not enough to get 50% or 55%. So we know he passed his leadership review by the Conservative membership base. What does that mean? These are Canadians that have a membership. Well, also Canadian residents and Canadian citizens that have a membership to the Conservative Party. They pay their $15 fee. They're a member of the party. And then through their EDAs, which is the electoral district associations, they get to put their delegates forward to go and vote. And so he passed that. But the other way of being removed as leader is through your caucus voting you out. If you recall, that happened with Leader O'Toole during the time where he lost the general election. He did bring Trudeau's government to a minority, kept it at a minority actually, won a few more seats, but it just still wasn't enough. And he did not go through a leadership review by the membership. Essentially, what they did was the caucus voted to remove him as leader, and he went into a caucus meeting as the leader of the Conservative Party, came out not as just as an MP, right, and no longer the leader of the Conservative Party. We saw under Andrew Scheer, he lost the election. There was supposed to be a leadership that was in 2019. In 2020, there was supposed to be a leadership review by the membership, a convention, and he stepped down in December, so therefore he didn't go through it. And if you recall, there was actually no convention held then, or a policy convention, because we went straight into COVID. So there was some talks of had Andrew Scheer not stepped down in December of 2019, he would have probably stayed leader for quite some time, because we went into the pandemic, right? So there's a lot of that speculation too, but that is history. Today, it's a Mark Carney government, so that's a completely, different aspect of things. So now, when you look at this, it doesn't look so well for Pierre Poilievre. And if already you have, four crossings, 40 MPs, worrying about their seats under his leadership, does that mean they're going to vote him out? And if so, who do they want to replace him with? Is there someone that is trying to come in and run for leadership? Because that would trigger a leadership election, or is it going to be an outsider? There's been wide rumors that somebody like Doug Ford would be interested in running. Now, this is not something he said he would do, but this is just speculation, and we're just speculating early. But these are going to be very interesting movements that will start happening after Monday, when we see what happens in those 3 vacant seats in the by-election. So a lot of things to, be mindful of. And when it comes to tech space, well, we have the Artemis 2 that took its mission to the moon, and it's captivated the world. And in a way, it was a big relief from what we saw happen on constant news when it's about the war and everything else. Now, we know that Artemis 2 mission marks humanity's first crewed return to the moon in over 50 years, right? So it's carrying astronauts to the lunar orbit. And its key mission was to take, key steps towards what would be a long-term lunar exploration, and, of course, an eventual mission to Mars. So this is all the precursor to that, and it's really ignited global interest around it. I mean, we all waited to see when Artemis actually took off just, a few days ago. Now, what does that mean for Canada? We know that there's a Canadian astronaut his name is Jeremy Hansen. He is making history in Canada as a part of Artemis 2 crew, and he is the first Canadian ever to travel to the moon. So this is big, big news for Canada. But it's not just with our astronaut. Canadians are contributing beyond just personnel with key technologies and supporting communications and mission operations. So this is a highlight for Canada's growing role in the space exploration, which is a very good news. When it comes to entertainment, well, we know that streaming services has been the main thing that, Canadians rely on. So there, you have your mainstream news, the mainstream channels that Canadians watch. And then, of course, YouTube as, one of the biggest platforms to be able to consume content. But then you have the streaming services where it comes to being able to watch your favorite shows from the 90s to movies from that era, and of course, new releases. And we saw a lot of big blockbuster releases happen just on streaming services, no longer taking us to the movie theater, but on the streaming platforms. But what's happening? We saw a saturation in the market. Netflix really did lead for quite some time. If you recall Blockbuster before Netflix, where you actually used to go and you used to rent your DVDs, and, even before that, cassettes. And if you recall Rogers Video, well, that all changed shape when technology forefront came in terms of streaming. No longer do you own the video or the DVD that you would purchase or rent. Now it's about streaming services. Nobody owns it. You could purchase it, but it sits on the platform of the streaming provider. Now, the costs are climbing, even though, it climbed to about $20 a month. There has been different levels of subscription where it comes with ads. And if you're okay with watching ads, then you could pay the lower fees. And that's kind of a way that these streaming services have decided to not lose their market share. When, affordability became an issue, people just realized, wait a minute, I'm subscribing to 3, 4, 5 streaming services. I'm paying, almost $80. Hey, I was paying cable $80 to $100. I withdrew from cable, went on minimal cable, and decided to take on, streaming services. And, because the shows you like, or the movies that you prefer, or the documentaries, they'll sit on different platforms depending on who owns the rights to that content. And then it just grows and grows. And there was that competition that happened. So when people started deactivating their services, seeing, well, I'm not nearly consuming as much content as I'm paying for it. And when you add your internet, prices, having home internet, your mobile, obviously you need data and your plan. And then if you have cable subscription, and now you have 2 to 3 different streaming services, it really adds up, right? If not in the hundreds, right? Realistically. So what happened? Well, the streaming services realized, okay, if people are deactivating, that affects our market share. That affects our market share and our subscription fees. Well, it's also going to affect our ability to purchase content, very valued content, and also create value content in terms of our studios, right? So that was a big thing. So they said, okay, well, how about we come up with, and then there was that password sharing issue that was the case, right? So one account that's paying, and then it's operating between family members or friends who are logging in at different, IP addresses and consuming the content. So it came up with different structures. They even came up with, a few more dollars, and your friends and family can have your shared plan, just like we see in the mobile plans where, your friends and family can pool minutes and, be an add-on. So that is what the streaming services came up with. So now you're seeing these different models take place, but then you have Prime Video, right? That is a key thing when it comes to having a Prime account, which allows you to get your Amazon packages and access to all of that. Well, it's jumping its tiers, from ad-free to with ads. We're seeing that even with Spotify, right? Jumping incrementally from $12 to $13. So this is a way in terms of to see how can we reduce more churn and make things a little bit more affordable. Now, where does that stand with the future of streaming and how it's competing with the likes of YouTube, or if it's even competitive? We'd love to hear your thoughts on it. And when it comes to the tech sector and of course EVs, we know that the Canadian government was for a long time, even under the Trudeau government, was subsidizing, right? If you purchased an electric vehicle, you would get a subsidy. This was something even under, if you recall, in Ontario under the Kathleen Wynne government, and then things shifted a little bit. Some subsidies were cut, and then there was the whole initiative of no, we need to invest and we need to make sure the whole EV investment. Well, that all changed when President Trump became president and decided that, no, we're not going to do this whole EV thing, which, then you had the American auto sector really pull back on their investments on future EV models, like such as Ford and the rest of them. Well, since Mark Carney took a trip to China to be able to have better relations with them, well, a Chinese company called BYD has now agreed to expand into Canada with 20 dealerships. This is a big deal because if you recall, upon the meeting that Prime Minister Mark Carney had in China and to start the trade relations, you had President Trump say, well, if that goes ahead, he's going to put a tariff on Canada because he does not want to have Chinese goods trickle from Canada to the United States to compete with the American auto sector. But what does it mean for Canada? Well, this Chinese electric vehicle company, it's a giant BYD company, is making its major push into the Canadian market. It's the 20 dealerships that it's announced that it's going to open this year through its local partners. And what does it mean? It's a signal from Ottawa saying that they're going to shift strategy and actively explore Chinese auto investments to reduce reliance on the United States, right? We know that Ontario is a key factor with a lot of, if you recall the auto sector, the plants closing because they didn't know what the tariffs meant. And so many Canadians were laid off immediately. And that had a massive impact in those communities that those auto plants are in, because those local communities those small businesses rely on the people that live there, and it's just a domino effect. So what the federal government has agreed to is to allow 49,000 Chinese-built electric vehicles annually into this country, effectively, creating a new emergence in the market. So this is stuff to keep an eye on to see what did those trade agreements that Mark Carney went to go open up relations with all those countries, what does that mean for the Canadian economy? Will it create jobs? We know 20 dealerships could potentially create jobs. What does that mean for the auto sector? That's all to be seen. This is all the time we have on Ymedia Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh. I'll see you again tomorrow. Thank you and be well.
Ymedia Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.